is watching. The Illuminati are planning to take over the world. The species have arrived. Grab your hats. This is tinfoil hat time.
Welcome back to Switch to Linux. It's another tinfoil hat time. Grab a snack. Today, we are going to be talking about mind control. Mind control. What is it? Do we have to be concerned? Has it ever happened? Can we be directed through advertising, maybe other means, into doing things we might not otherwise want to be doing? So we're going to dive into that. We're going to look at this and go back first into some history. The first root of subliminal messaging seems to have come from around the 5th century BC. Early Greeks were using this as a means to influence people. Not a whole lot different than what Roosevelt did, doing the propaganda machine to get United States citizens prompted for World War II, because ultimately we did not want to enter a world war. Unfortunately, FDR knew that war is very profitable for the economic health of a nation, and trying to get us out of that final bit of the Great Depression is what he wanted to do. Then, of course, BBC began broadcasting on radio for the first time. I'm not sure this was the very first radio station, but it was certainly an early radio station, and some people were so concerned about it, they thought radio was so sinister they called it the voice of the devil. Believed that whatever was played on the radio could be used to mass control people. They may not have been too far from the facts. Of course, as things go on, there was a publicity, high public case done in the 50s and 60s by a man named, Vicari, I believe, who had allegedly, 1957 marketing researcher James Vicari, he claims to have found a dramatic increase in Coca-Cola and popcorn sales by running flashes that phrase "drink Coca-Cola and eat popcorn" for 1/200th of a second during a movie. Statistics showed an increase in sales 58% and an 18% increases in Coca-Cola sales. Now, that study, which is still sometimes talked about, was actually a fraud study. It was fraudulent. That was not actually true. But it raised people's questions. Could you manipulate people in some way or another? And so government got interested in this. So there were a variety of different mind control studies. It was the Ultra, I forget the name of the study. But there was a high-profile CIA case that ran for 20 years before it was deemed illegal, and so they stopped doing it. They were using a variety of different mind control techniques, including torture, abuse, drug induction, all sorts of things in order to get people to change their various mental states. And then people started toying around with putting subliminal messages into music and subliminal messages into movies and television shows to get people to buy products, do things that they may not otherwise think about doing. And that prompted them now there were two different legislative bills that came up. Neither of them were passed, but they would ban this kind of stuff. But it was in 1974 that the FCC, who at that time still did the public interest, they said whether effective or not, such broadcasts clearly intended to be deceptive, and so they are not in the public's best interest. So they made it illegal to do things in a film that would suggest somebody does something. So, with that being said, let's go back and have a look at some of the history of this and see if we can parse any reality out. So here's a few articles from the Business Insider. the Business Insider, the shocking drink and incredible Coke history of subliminal advertising. They're saying, looking for new ways to publicize your products. Have you considered implanting suggestions in your current advertising? They link your product to sex and power. So of course, there's a statement that says, sex sells, and there's actually a lot of research that debunks that, but that's the direction this article wants to go. So we're just going to go ahead and have a look at this. Just have a little gander. So the birth of subliminal advertising, as we know it, dates to 1957, when a market researcher named James Vickery inserted the words "eat popcorn and drink Coca-Cola" into a movie. The words appeared for a single frame, allegedly long enough for the subconscious to pick it up, but too short for the viewer to be aware of it. The subliminal ads created an 18.1% increase in Coke sales, 57% increase in popcorn sales. And, of course, like we said, that was a fraudulent case. It was not actually true. But other people have jumped onto this and said, does this actually work? And there's a lot of studies and research into this now to suggest that this is the case. All right. And so, while we know this, there's a lot of different marketing advertisements that do this. Subjects here played computer games, which a series of words flashed before them for thousandths of a second. One set got words like wise, astute, accomplished. The other set got senile, dependent, and diseased. Despite the fact these words flashed far too quickly for the conscious to be perceived, those who received the words, the positive words, exited the room significantly faster than those who got the negative words. Not too much unlike the situation that Facebook was trying to do with manipulating people's emotions, feeding algorithmically some people only negative stories and actually cause some serious problems. And so that was certainly one of those situations. All right, so what do they do? So here's a few examples of ads. So they suggest here a sexy outline of a woman on top of a can of Coke. I guess if you look hard enough, maybe. Is this message subliminally racist? Maybe. This is the one I'll comment on the most here. The words Coca-Cola supposedly engraved in the one ring to rule them all. Well, I happen to have this movie laying around. And so I looked at this and I played it in very slow-mo. And no, the words Coca-Cola are not on the ring, at least in the movie. They may be there somewhere else, maybe in a marketing campaign, maybe in some commercial. I don't know. But as far as getting the movie and watching this scene, this is the very scene where Gandalf throws the ring into the fire, drops it in Frodo's hand. He has to look at the ring. And what they're saying here is the words Coca-Cola supposedly engraved on the one ring. No, they are not there. I looked very carefully. And then, of course, there's some other ones. They just get progressively worse from there. So I'm not going to go any further in that particular article. But the fact is that there's always been this interplay. And obviously, as one guy who analyzes these things, there's an entire industry in Hollywood to figure out where to best put, product placements inside of your movies, TV shows. It's an entire thing. And ABC came down when some people were saying that this is potentially suggestive. They came down and said, well, mostly looking at like the sex and the violence and things in Hollywood. They said, well, there's no evidence that any of these movies or anything else like this impacts the viewers. And so another gentleman comes up and says, well, then you better start refunding billions of dollars in ad revenue, because if you don't think that putting something in a movie influences people to act on it, then what are you doing selling ad time? It's a very good question. Here's the popcorn subliminal advertising read from Snopes. They say it's false, but if you actually read this whole story, it's fascinating. I'm going to jump over this part because I want to get into this, talking about what the impact of products in movies and television can actually do. Is anybody aware that Ray-Ban sunglasses, the company Ray-Ban, almost went out of business? It wasn't until the 80s when Tom Cruise wore this particular style of sunglasses in the movie Risky Business. Sales went up 800% for this model of sunglasses and pushed the company out of bankruptcy. That is the power. Now, of course, Risky Business was a whole lot more about bad lifestyles than about anything else. And so, with that being said, it raises this question with the movie Risky Business. If the movie caused these sales of sunglasses, which he would on in the scene a couple of times in the movie, 800%, the entire movie was about pushing sex and drugs, alcoholism, prostitution, things like that. If simply seeing the sunglasses caused that much increase in sales of sunglasses, what did the whole rest of the movie, which spent time glorifying those types of behaviors, actually do to the people? And that's an interesting question. Now, I pulled this particular article out, and I'll link it in the description there when we're done, because it actually has a lot of the sales reference. This is legitimately true. I did a lot of research into this one particular point for one of the books I have in my list. So you can actually see this. That's the information directly from the company there, that this movie pushed them out of bankruptcy and started a major ton more companies putting their products and services into things, which is why, I think the first time I ever heard of Uber was watching some episode of like Law and Order or something. They talk about, they get an Uber, and it's like, you never really hear about it until that kind of stuff happens. And so this is really the impact, is that these types of things can direct us into doing things we may not otherwise be doing in reality. It's suggestion. It's putting it out in front of you. And this is why I'm so against all of this direct targeted advertising, because you can push and target the same person. In fact, you could probably gather information so narrowly to individual people based upon individual groups that you could do an experiment to see, can you get a person to buy something they otherwise wouldn't know, simply by forcing the ad too much. And that seems to be the direction we're moving. And if it ended right there, I'd be like, that is kind of an interesting situation, but it gets deeper, darker, and infinitely more sinister in our world, because some of the research is starting to look at interesting questions, like decoding the thoughts of patients who can't even blink. So here's some comatose people, some way they call lock-in people, people who cannot communicate. Traditionally, if somebody's to this point to where they're mostly paralyzed, you get them to answer yes or no questions with the blink of an eye. You might have seen things like Lorenzo's Oil, which is the true story about the boy who had adrenal leukodystrophy, whose parents figured out what is a prognosis and a treatment would be for the disease. And if you watch that near the end, where they stop the movement of the disease by blocking the saturated fat acid chains, the things that break down the myelin sheaths off the nerves, he starts to gain not movement, but the ability to at least to blink. And so from that, they were able to communicate with this kid about what he wanted and didn't want with simple yes or no questions in the blink of an eye. Well, what do you do when somebody cannot even blink their eyes? So there's a lot of research going on right now to figure out how do you get in the minds of these people. And it turns out that utilizing algorithms to measure brain waves, you can actually determine you can determine specific responses to questions. You can determine emotional responses, a lot of different things. And so this raises some interesting questions. Obviously, this has great areas of getting into the minds and questioning the minds of people who can't otherwise blink or communicate in any way. You could still gather some useful data and information from this, assuming you're right. Now, the problem is, anytime you get a situation like this, you always have to worry about the antithesis, okay? Worry about that antithesis, and that is, can you work things the opposite direction? Now, if you follow if you follow the Christian circles, there's a children's program called Adventures in Odyssey. I speak about it every now and again. There are episodes in that series that are so far ahead of its time. There is it spanned 4 different albums. It was the Novacom series. I think last time I was actually at the store, you can actually get just a disc with all the entire Novacom series. It's like 37 episodes or something crazy like that. This was the best group that group of people ever put together, because it was basically this world that was, or this evil company that was trying to control the world through a mind manipulation. They started with television set boxes that would push out radio waves, that the one, genius guy Eugene was working on it. And once they figured out, of course, they started to say, this is to help people, bound in wheelchairs. What if we can hook this up and allow them to utilize radio waves to communicate and turn on a light switch or type on a keyboard? Awesome things. Well, as soon as they figure this out, they figure out how to, they're like, well, we want to know how to reverse it. How do we reverse that process and that sequence? And so that in and of itself is where the company was really focused on doing, and that is unfortunately where we're starting to see some of this. So while it's a good thing to say, hey, now we can get into somebody's mind and understand what they're saying, scientists figured out how you can kind of reverse that and implant thoughts directly into people. So this is an implanting thoughts directly into monkey brains. Actually, let's do this one first, because this is the mouse brains. So what they did here was this. No, this one. This is the mouse brains. So this happened, I think, in 2012, where, if you're familiar with the Pavlov's experiment, this is where you can, ring a bell and then, you ring a bell and then you feed a dog treat. In fact, if you watch here, if I were to pick up these guys here with any amount of noise, and wiggle them, you'll see that the cat will immediately stand up. In fact, let's just go ahead and test Pavlov's law right now, shall we? All right, here's the kitty cam. Boom, cat's up, man. Look at that. I mean, now if I were to open that up and turn to him, he would come over. That's Pavlov's law. So what they were able to do is measure what are the brain cycles that go on inside of a mouse when they hit the stimuli and then they shocked the bottom of the cage. They figured out what those were, and then they stimulated those in another mouse, and they were able to trigger in that mouse the memory of getting shocked in response to the stimuli. That's a small memory to input into something, and it always starts small and innocuous. But what happens, remember we talked about before, when a crime is committed, sometimes the prosecutors care a whole lot more about prosecuting a case than they do about finding who did it. And so much so that it gets to the point to where we start to see people moving, we see district attorneys and whatever else saying, we may or may not have done it, but we have enough evidence to put you close enough to the scene to put you away for a long time. So if you confess to it, then we'll give you the lightest possible sentence. But if we take it to court and you're prosecuted, well, A, you'll have to pay for all that. And then B, of course, you'll risk going to prison for a whole lot longer. And so a whole lot of uninformed people will take the plea bargain, even if they didn't do the crime. What if you were to take this entire technology and implant into somebody the memory that they did a crime? If you were to figure out how to input into somebody else's mind that they did something, even if they didn't, it raises the highest degree of ethics questions, because Aldous Huxley said that your mind, your memory, is your own personal journal, your own personal story that only you can see. But when other people can get into there, think back. There are things every one of us have done that are extremely private, extremely embarrassing, and that nobody else knows. The thoughts that go through our mind. We don't want to. In fact, another one of these adventures and odysseys. Do you ever want to know what somebody else is thinking? Like, no, that's a bad idea to know what someone else is thinking all the time. Because sometimes our thoughts betray our hearts. This is what's so wrong about when somebody utters a racial slur. You extrapolate from that racial slur what their thoughts might be, but it may or may not even be accurate. But what if you can now take somebody and implant a thought into their head and then turn that around on them and make them believe they believed it? This is dangerous ground. And so this is not all tinfoil hattiness. This is from the National Institutes of Mental Health. And what they're doing here is they're looking at ways to stimulate memory. Once again, if you could stimulate memories, you could help people with Alzheimer's and dementia. If you could suppress memories, you can help people with PTSD. But if you know how it all works, you could implant memories and make people think that they've done things they haven't actually done. And it raises the whole question of morality and law in the legal system. What is it that we, what is the basis of our law? What is the basis? Are we guilty for thinking about the crime, or are we guilty for the commission of crime? Or do we commit a crime because we remember committing the crime because somebody else implanted the thought that we committed a crime? Is it bad for somebody else to know exactly what our mental state is? Maybe if we get this technology working and we force every one of our children to wear little hats with little brainwave sensors so we can sense, are they aggravated? Are they frustrated? Of course, this is really good because it provides instant feedback for everything the teacher would need to know what student is frustrated, even if he's not telling you they're frustrated. Maybe you could even prevent a case of intermittent explosive disorder and prevent a student from acting out violently in your school. Fascinating thoughts. Is that too much private data? To have somebody knowing your entire mental state live streaming to your system, especially in a world where it's not too uncommon that we could probably import thoughts just as easily as export them. This brings us to our article, Compliments of Keegan. Forget Facebook. China is mining data directly from workers' brains on an industrial scale. I actually went back and forth the internet scouring for other cases of this, and it does seem legit. Hopefully it is. But basically, a lot of different, it's not just factories, it's a lot of Chinese government-based applications, from transportation people to everything else. Basically what they do is they have a little device that they put inside the helmets that can live monitor the behavior and mental state of the people. All right, so and with this being said, what happens is they can actually see. So there's a guy sitting in a chair at computers, much like the room I'm in back here, where there's one or two guys monitoring computer screens, and computers are pulling in all of the data, all of the emotional states, all of the mental states of all of the workers on the factory floor. And if anything seems out of the ordinary, the algorithm peeks it and displays that on the screen for the worker to see, and then they can narrow in on that individual person and see if they need a break or whatever else, because you see a spike in their emotional state. And so the technology used in Hangzhou, a state grid at Shanghai Electric Power, was boosted the company's profits by about 2 billion yen. I wonder if the employees saw any of that. Which is $315 million increase in profitability since it was rolled out in 2014, according to an official overseeing the company's emotional surveillance program. There's no doubt about its effect. The company and roughly 40,000 employees manage the power supply and distribution work to homes and businesses across the province, a task that Chang said they were able to do to a higher standard thanks to surveillance technology. It has significantly reduced the number of mistakes made by our workers, improved understanding between the employees and the company. He did not say if the technology was limited to trainees. The company estimated that the technology had helped it increase revenue by 140 million yen in the past 2 years. Is that won or yen? My apologies, I don't know. One of the main centers of research in China is NeuroCap, the central government-funded brain surveillance program at Ningbo University. The program has been implemented on more than a dozen factories and businesses. Jinjia, associate professor of brain science and cognitive psychology at Ningbo University's business school, said the emotional employee is a key post could affect the entire production line, jeopardizing his or her safety as well as that of others. Wonderful justification. When the system issues a warning, the manager asks the worker to take a day off or to move to a less critical post. Some jobs require high concentration. There's no room for mistakes. They thought we could read their mind. This caused some discomfort and resistance in the beginning. After a while, they got used to the device. It looked and felt just like a safety helmet. They wore it all day at work. Jin said the present China's brain-reading technology was on par with that of the West, but China was the only country where there had been reports of massive use of the technology in the workplace. In the United States, for example, applications have been limited to archers trying to improve their performance in competition. The unprecedented amount of data from users could help the system improve and enable China to surpass competitors over the next few years. Seeming to say, who said you were watching? Keegan, were you watching Matrix? Does this not sound like we're being plugged into the Matrix to produce our own system? Man, if there's one sci-fi movie I was hoping wouldn't come to case, it was indeed The Matrix. Particularly since I don't know how you can have such a good first movie and the sequel and triquel, whatever they were, suck so bad. With improved speed and sensitivity, the device could even become a mental keyboard, allowing the user to control a computer or mobile phone with their mind. Sounds like Adventures in Odyssey now. The research team confirmed the device and technology and has been used in China's military operations, but declined to provide more information. The technology is also being used in medicine. That sounds exciting. Ma Wan, a doctor at Shanghai Hospital, my apologies, people, I cannot read these names. Shanghai said the facility was working with Fudan University to develop a more sophisticated version of technology to monitor the patient's emotions and prevent violent incidents. Let's just strap all of our members of society now to little caps, and that way the government knows exactly who's going to burst when and where. Isn't that exciting? Of course, we have to have GPS trackers and these things. That's old tech. Everyone's used to GPS trackers. Together, this different information can give us more precise estimate of the patient's mental status. Hospital welcomed the technology, hoped it could warn medical staff from potential violent outbursts from a patient. I wonder if the doctors have this too. How about the politicians? I bet it's not the directors of the companies. They're not, immune to all this stuff. They don't have any of that. They're the red assets. Only the little people will be controlled, monitored, watched, tracked. All of a sudden, the tinfoil hat carries with it a whole new line of protection. This is freaky stuff, people. This is freaky stuff. I have to say this is one of the more devastating tinfoil hat times I think I've done. In that we've moved from this area where simple glimpses on a screen and product placement very well could direct how a person behaves. To actually doing science, to implant thoughts, implant memories, and identify the emotional states of people, factory workers on the front lines. Who's monitoring the behaviors of the watchman? Who indeed watches the watchman? How do we know they're not the emotional high ones? How easy is it to manipulate this data or plant the data so you can put somebody away who is about to break out violently but just hasn't done it yet? Pre-crime, as it were. When do we put them away? Here's another fun implication. The airline captain has to put this on so that the airport can clear his mental state before taking off. Influence of the government on airlines and pilots in China is probably larger than any other countries. If the authorities make up their mind to bring the device to the cockpit, I don't think they can be stopped. This means pilots need to sacrifice some of their privacy for the sake of public safety. Was it Ben Franklin who said, "He who wishes to sacrifice some of his privacy for security deserves neither privacy nor security"? Thought police were the secret police in George Orwell's novel 1984 who investigated and punished people for personal and political thoughts not approved by the authorities. There is no law or regulation to limit the use of this kind of equipment in China. The employer may have a strong incentive to use the technology for higher profit, and the employees are usually too weak to take in a position to say no. No, I don't want to wear a thing on my head. Go home. We will hire somebody else for another quarter who will. Selling of Facebook data is bad enough. Brain surveillance can take privacy abuse to a whole new level. We have some thinking to do in our society, people. We have a lot of thinking to do, indeed. This is dangerous ground. Thinking about manipulating people's thoughts, our emotions, our hearts, our souls. These are very difficult things. We need to stand up. We need to stop and say, maybe we need to put the brakes on this and or have some regulation on this. But we as people, the take home, don't sacrifice your privacy of this matter for that. We all have things in our heads that are nobody else's business. We have to take a strong, firm stance against this stuff, and we have to be careful. Be careful with your phones, with your accounts, with your user data. The last thing they can't get from us is the thoughts going through our head. And that's the very thing they're coming to do. Beware. If you'd like to help support the channel, check out switchtolinux.com/support for all the current ways you can help support us. We do have a Patreon page, patreon.com/TomM, and you can pick up a t-shirt, coffee cup, water bottle, etc. at shop.switchtolinux.com. Thank you for watching. Keep that hat on.